The blinds were half closed, slanting the winter sunlight into thin bars across the conference table. The kind of light that made dust hang in the air, like it had something to say. Maya Pierce sat across from me, back straight, hands folded in that way they teach you in some HR webinar about authoritative empathy. She was fresh out of grad school, 28 at most, the kind of confidence you get from being told you're a visionary before you've ever been proven wrong. Her lipstick was perfect, her blazer new, and her eyes had that careful pity people use when they think they're about to do you a favor by ending your career. "Your experience is outdated thinking," she said, like she'd practiced the line in the mirror. "We need to modernize. We need to embrace and empower the LGBTQ plus community. And that means making some changes, starting with you." It was clinical, not cruel, not kind, just a decision already made. She didn't ask me to respond, but I smiled anyway. Not the tight-lipped smile of a man trying to save face. Just enough to make her second guess whether she'd really hit the mark. "I see," I said, leaning back in my chair. No argument, no fight. That was what she expected after all. Some kind of pushback she could file under resistant to change in the HR report. I wasn't going to give her that. My name is Daniel Rourke. I'm 55 years old. For the past 3 decades, I've been the lead systems architect for a multinational logistics firm called Stratagem Dynamics, which is what my resume says anyway. In reality, Stratagem is one of a dozen private sector shells feeding into an intelligence pipeline I've worked in since my early 20s. On paper, I built and maintained enterprise infrastructure. Off paper, I designed systems resilient enough to survive state-level cyber attacks and subtle enough to spot them before they landed. Maya didn't know any of that. To her, I was just the legacy guy who wrote the original framework our company still ran on. The same framework she now wanted to replace with something inclusive, scalable, and future-facing, as she put it. She saw me as the old gatekeeper, keeping the shiny new future from walking through the door. She had no idea the future she was inviting in had teeth. She kept talking about progress, about aligning with the values of a modern workforce, about how technology was not just tools, but statements. I let her words roll over me without catching. She didn't notice the subtle flick of my pen when I logged the time code in my head. Old habit. Everything in life worth remembering has a timestamp. When she was done, I stood, shook her hand, and thanked her for the opportunity. She smiled, relieved at how painless it had been, and I walked out. My security badge would still work until midnight. They never think to cut that off early. The air outside was sharp, brittle, like it might crack if I breathed too hard. I took my time walking to the truck, letting my mind work through the obvious. They'd hired a replacement already, someone who fit the modern vision she kept talking about. I didn't care about their resume or their pronouns. I cared about what kind of code they wrote and who might be reading it. On the drive home, I stayed off the main road, cutting through back streets and industrial lanes out of muscle memory. By the time I reached my place, the sky was leaning toward gray. I locked the front door, made coffee I wouldn't drink, and went straight to the desk in the back room. The one with no windows, just 2 towers humming under the desk and a triple monitor spread across the wall. I keyed into my private network, a mesh of air-gapped drives and mirrored servers I'd built over the years. From here, I still had eyes on Stratagem's backbone. They hadn't touched my deeper layers yet. Within seconds, I was watching packet flows from the new development environment. And that's when I saw it. Outbound pings, regular, precise, not to any known partner domains. These were tunneling out to masked endpoints through an obfuscated DNS chain. Whoever was running this new code was bleeding data off-site, slowly, patiently. The kind of slow that hides in plain sight. I sat back. This wasn't a rookie's mistake. This was engineered, but not by me, which meant someone had either slipped something into their deployment or the new team was already compromised. 6 months ago, that would have been my problem, my mission, my mess to clean. I told myself it wasn't anymore. I was out. They'd made sure of that. I closed the connection, powered down the monitor, and sat in the dark for a while, listening to the faint hum of the drives spinning down. My pulse was steady, my breathing even. I'd been cut out of the system before. I'd learned the first rule a long time ago. When they think you're gone, you see more than when you're inside. I stood, reached for the light switch, then stopped halfway. Not yet. The lab is just a spare bedroom with blackout curtains and a lock you can open from the inside with a paperclip. The hardware doesn't look like much either. 2 aging towers cooled better than they deserve. A rack with drives labeled in my handwriting, and a cheap lamp that tries hard and fails to be warm. I sat down, slid the chair back to the sweet spot where the fan hum becomes a metronome, and keyed in a sequence my muscles remembered faster than my mind. The back door I built years ago lived in the bones of Stratagem's core, a handshake buried under 5 layers of legitimate authentication. Most people look for doors in code. I prefer floorboards. You tap the right plank, the hallway opens, and no camera ever sees you pass. Their new repo announced itself with the kind of swagger fresh paint has. New branch names, cute emojis, a style guide long enough to be scripture. I tunneled in beneath it, tracing the commit history, watching fingerprints accumulate on files I'd once treated like vaults. Activity spikes at 2:14 a.m., 4:07 a.m., then again just before dawn. Offshore hours. The admin token they thought was master wasn't even a junior clerk where I sat. I still had the root of root, the key you make when you're young and paranoid, and no one tells you you're right to be both. The team wasn't a team. It was a consultant collective with a glossy site and mission statements that looked like they'd been A/B tested for virtue. Front and center was the face they sold. Ash Vega, brilliant, camera-ready, non-binary coder with a TED clip and a 1,000-watt smile. I watched one of their internal stand-ups through a borrowed lens. Ash didn't talk like an engineer to engineers. They talked like a conductor who knows the orchestra follows the baton. Clean cadence, perfect posture. They were good. The veneer wasn't the problem. Funding was. Shell corporations layered like lacquer, all dissolved into a parent entity that didn't exist until 18 months ago, registered to a mailbox you could rent by the hour. I traced payment rails backward, through 2 boutique funds and a green energy subsidiary that had never sold a kilowatt, until the thread disappeared into a jurisdiction that advertises discretion as a national sport. The names on those filings are not the kind that donate to the arts. They buy them. I took a breath and let the numbers recede so the faces could come back. Years ago, a defense research lab insisted their crown jewel never touch the internet. They were right and wrong. Air gaps keep honest people honest. The rest, build boats. We ferried data across with a courier who thought he was delivering coffee. I wrote the checksum routine that knew the difference between heat from a desk lamp and heat from a human hand. Another time, we pushed a false flag injection into a pirate market so loud it drowned out the real operation walking past it. And when an insider tried to carry a key out in his head, I sat with him in a stairwell at 3 a.m. while the city snowed and convinced him there are softer ways to betray yourself. By mid-morning, my eyes felt like I'd been reading at sea. I needed a hallway that moved. I grabbed my coat and stepped out into the kind of cold that makes your teeth remember their bones. The coffee shop 2 blocks over knows me as the man who tips too well and speaks too little. I was halfway through the door when a familiar shape turned and said my name like the word had just been invented. Tom LeDuc, network guy, decent golf swing, worse poker face. We used to fix each other's mistakes before anyone knew they were mistakes. Didn't think I'd see you, he said, trying casual and landing on jittery. Things are different. How different? I asked, and he laughed the laugh people do when they aren't sure who might be listening. Maya's on a crusade, he said, lowering his voice. Revolutionizing security, her words, not mine. Scrubbing out all the old legacy crap. He took a sip he didn't want. She said your fail-safes were fear-based. Told the board fear breaks innovation. I stirred a coffee I wouldn't finish. Which fail-safes? The silent monitors, he said, eyes flicking to the window, like GPS satellites might be hiding in the glass. The ones that watched vendor traffic to defense partners without watching them, you know? She called them invasive. They turned a bunch off yesterday. If he noticed my pulse, he didn't show it. I paid for his drink. We didn't hug. He left first. After he was gone, I stood in the doorway, counting to 25 so the patterns didn't line up neatly for anyone who might be charting them. Back in the lab, the monitors came up like theater curtains. I pulled logs from subsystems they didn't know were separate and ran a diff across the last 24 hours. The watchdog script I wrote after the Tacoma incident, when a foreign asset piggybacked on a contractor's billing pipeline, wasn't just muted, it was erased, the file header overwritten with a cheery comment about cleaning out deprecated cruft. They'd replaced it with a dashboard widget that reported feelings instead of facts. I reached for an old habit I try not to touch, the little prayer I say to Silicon. Then I got to work. The backup of the backup, my dead man Kron, had preserved the last heartbeat from the watchdog before they pulled the cord. I replayed it frame by frame. There it was, a pulse of outbound packets riding inside image optimization requests, the kind of traffic you'd wave through at the border because it smiles for the camera. The destination wasn't a partner. It was a mask on a mask. A CDN node bought 3 weeks ago by a company that doesn't sell content and knows a lot about delivery. Ash appeared in another window, laughing at something off-screen during their stand-up, the kind of laugh that makes rooms relax. I don't assign guilt to pronouns or posture. I assign it to math. The math was wrong. The cadence of pings was too regular to be organic. The jitter plotted to blend with weekend load patterns. Someone had surveyed our rhythms and tuned theirs to our breath. For a moment I could smell winter from a decade ago, the metallic scent of an unheated bunker where I learned you can listen to a network the way you listen to a person, by what it says and what it doesn't. I remembered the colonel who told me silence is the loudest alarm, and the analyst who taught me that pretty interfaces hide ugly exits. I widened the capture and watched the leak repeat. Packet, pause, each one a needle sliding under a fingernail. I thought about Maya's speech, about legacy and progress and statements. I thought about the quiet things I built to keep wolves from learning our front door was made of wood. They don't even know they've left the door open. The trick to slipping into someone's cloud system isn't brute force. It's patience. You don't ram the gate. You walk the fence line until you find the board that's already loose. I started with the credentials Ash's team used for automated deployment, not the flashy public-facing API keys, but the quiet service accounts they assumed were invisible. They'd wrapped them in just enough encryption to keep honest auditors satisfied, But the trust chain underneath was the same one I'd architected years ago. I still knew where it bent. Once inside, I took the long way around, mapping the infrastructure like a cartographer sketching shorelines. No sudden moves, no code injections yet, just observing the shape of their castle. Microservices spun up and down like fireflies, containerized workloads whispering to each other through secure channels. At first glance, it was clean, modern, efficient. But clean doesn't mean pure. I followed a heartbeat of requests from a logging service and found them tunneling through encrypted proxies. The headers were stripped down to bone, the destinations masked under rotating domains that didn't belong to any vendor on record. Whoever built this knew the art of making something look like it wasn't there. I traced one of the routes far enough to confirm my suspicion. It wasn't a staging mirror or test sandbox. It was a handoff. The requests funneled into an address block registered to an advocacy technology initiative, a name so generically noble it practically dared you to question it. The block's ownership history was a blur of recent transfers between nonprofits, research collectives, and an art co-op that had never hosted a single image file. That's camouflage. I'd worn it myself. The next morning, I decided to place myself in the open for the first time since I'd been retired. The cafe on Harlow Street still had the same burnt coffee smell it had 10 years ago, the same flicker in the second pendant light. I took the corner table with a clear line of sight to the register. It didn't take long. Maya walked in, wearing a jacket you don't buy on a manager's salary, and ordered something with oat milk and more syllables than coffee needs. She spotted me before I looked up, and her smile was the kind you reserve for someone you think you've already beaten. "Well, Daniel," she said, approaching my table with that casual confidence of someone on home turf. "Didn't expect to see you around here. How's retirement?" "Quiet," I said, which was true in the way shadows are quiet. She set her cup down and leaned slightly forward. "I know our meeting wasn't ideal, but I hope you understand. It's not personal. This industry's been an old boys club for too long. We're building something different now. Inclusive, progressive, tech that reflects the people it serves." I let her talk, nodding occasionally, like a man humoring a sermon he's heard before. She didn't know I'd already followed her progressive mission straight into a tunnel that didn't end anywhere she thought it did. She didn't know that every time she said different, I saw the same pattern I'd seen in Havana, in Tallinn, in 3 other cities that learned too late what happens when you let strangers write the locks on your own doors. "Good luck with that," I said, gathering my coat. I paid for my coffee in cash, left her with the comfort of thinking I'd walked away. Back in the lab, I dug deeper. The advocacy block's servers ran repositories of open-source tools, browser extensions, encryption libraries, secure messaging clients, the kind of projects journalists and activists flock to. Each was squeaky clean in public, but buried in their commit histories were subtle rewrites, the kind you'd miss unless you diffed them against older forks. A line of code that altered a checksum routine. A buffer expanded just enough to fit something else. They were laundering intrusions through the goodwill of the open-source community, planting hooks in the very tools people trusted to keep them safe. It was elegant, and it was exactly the kind of operation state actors loved, because no one questions a gift that works. The irony was a stone in my teeth. To Maya and her board, I was the relic, the obstacle to progress. But I could see the trap she'd walked into, like it was lit in neon. I'd spent a lifetime chasing threats that hid inside modernization. They called it innovation until the damage was done. Then they called me. This time, no one was calling. So I started building. The countermeasure would have to be invisible. No flashy alerts, no logs that screamed sabotage. I wrote it as a ghost in their system, a dormant sequence that lived in memory, fragmented across processes. It would wake only when a specific keystroke pattern was entered, one I'd never use by accident. When triggered, it wouldn't just sever the tunnel. It would reroute it, feeding the intruders a loop of perfectly believable but entirely fabricated data, enough to keep them busy while the real system sealed itself off. I worked for hours, losing track of time until the room's air felt like it had been exhaled too many times. When the build passed my final integrity check, I sat back and let myself breathe. Then I pivoted to their comms platform, a video conferencing suite I'd helped license years ago. The integration they used was sloppy, enough to let me slip a listener into their next meeting without tripping authentication. That night, their team gathered on Zoom, faces tiled across my monitor. Ash was running the show, animated, leaning into the camera like a coach at halftime. Maya sat to their right, notebook in hand, nodding with the seriousness of someone who thought she was steering the ship. "We're ready to deploy Phase 2 tomorrow," Maya said, her voice carrying that same practiced authority she'd used on me in the conference room. I leaned closer to the screen, feeling the old stillness settle into my bones. "So am I whispered. Phase 2 wasn't a redesign or an upgrade. It was a fuse. The architecture diagrams I'd lifted from their staging environment told the story in the quiet ways blueprints do. The lines that weren't supposed to touch. The authentication chains that bent at angles you never see in legitimate systems. They were about to integrate a new single sign-on framework into every partner network Stratagem touched. Corporate, government, international vendors. If it went live, the compromised keys would spread faster than anyone could revoke them, granting quiet entry into thousands of systems. Not with a battering ram, but with a handshake those systems would think was friendly. I'd seen that kind of breach before, in another lifetime, under a different flag. Back then, we'd spent months trying to close doors we didn't even know had been opened. Entire networks had to be burned to the ground, rebuilt from scratch. It's not a technical failure when that happens. It's a trust failure, and trust doesn't reboot. So I moved like I was back on an op. I pulled the Pelican case from under my desk and laid it out on the kitchen table. Burners, each preloaded with isolated toolkits. 2 encrypted drives, one for infiltration, one for extraction. A set of lock bypass tools wrapped in a cloth that still smelled faintly of machine oil. I charged everything from a solar brick to keep it off the grid. No paper, no cloud, no credit trail. I sent a secure burst to an old contact, just a ping, no details. A signal we'd agreed on years ago that meant potential infrastructure compromise. Be ready. His reply was just as short. Standing by. It was during one of my reconnaissance passes through their internal comms that I caught the truth I'd been hoping wasn't there. Maya wasn't just a mark. She wasn't being played. She was at the center of it. I saw her in a closed chat with 2 of the shell company operators talking about rollout timelines and asset transitions. They weren't paying her in salary. They were buying her equity in the post-breach network, a seat at the table when the new system became the system. She was selling out every door I'd ever locked for them, and doing it with the kind of confidence you only get when you think the future belongs to you. By the time night came, I was already in motion. The new office had tighter security than when I'd left. Cameras on the east and south entries, badge access logs tied to live alerts. But their integrators hadn't mapped every blind spot. I had. The west maintenance gate still had a mechanical lock from before the retrofit. The key on my ring slid into it like it had been waiting. Inside, I kept to the routes that cameras couldn't see, along the inner wall of the print room, behind the storage cages, up the stairwell where the motion sensors were angled too high. I didn't rush. You don't run in enemy territory unless you're already caught. The server room door recognized my old credentials. No one had purged them from the backup access control list. Another oversight. Inside, the hum of the racks was the same as it had always been, steady and low, like the room was breathing. I found the core cluster and slid my drive into a service port, masking it under a scheduled firmware check. The countermeasure uploaded in fragments, stitching itself together in volatile memory so there'd be no trace on disk. It took 7 minutes. I spent 6 of those watching the temperature gauges, listening for the change in fan pitch that means someone else just came online. It never came. When the final checksum matched, I pulled the drive, wiped the port, and started back the way I'd come. My plan had been to leave without touching anything else, but halfway down the hall, I saw it. A small, unmarked envelope on the floor against the wall, just far enough from the light to make me step closer. Inside was a USB stick, black, unbranded. On its side, in neat block lettering, was a name I hadn't heard spoken in years. My old call sign from covert days, a relic from operations that never made it into any archive. Only a handful of people alive knew it, and fewer still had the nerve to use it. It hadn't fallen there by accident. It was placed, waiting. I turned it over in my hand, feeling the weight of it. Not heavy, but deliberate. The urge to slot it into a port right there was strong, but that's how you end up bleeding through your own teeth in a concrete basement. Instead, I slid it into a side pocket of my pack, zipped it closed, and kept moving. The cold air outside hit my face like a reset. I walked 3 blocks before taking the first real breath since I'd gone in. The night was quiet, in the way cities only get, after most of the lights go out, and before the first deliveries arrive. My mind kept circling the same truth, one I'd spent a career both chasing and avoiding. So it's not just me hunting. The morning broke flat and gray, the kind of light that made the world feel paused. I sat in my control room, coffee cooling beside the keyboard, watching the feed spool across 3 monitors. Stratagem's internal dashboard showed the rollout timer for Phase 2, ticking down in quiet confidence. Across another screen, a packet analyzer traced the heartbeat between their staging servers and the masked domains I'd been tracking for weeks. On the far right, a hijacked video feed from their war room offered the human angle. Ash pacing with a headset, Maya standing with arms folded, her face set in that calm, managerial mask people wear when they believe they've already won. The hostile network was live and waiting on the other end, hidden in plain sight behind activist slogans and grant-funded veneers. I let the code I'd written breathe in the background, dormant but ready. It was a phantom, lines scattered in memory, waiting for the one moment when their operation would be most vulnerable. I wasn't here to stop them early. Early meant they could recover. I was here to kill the momentum when they were too far committed to retreat clean. At 9:43, their deployment began, cascading through integration points like a lit fuse, racing along a trail of powder. Service after service updated its authentication module, new certificates slotting into place. Partner networks began to handshake. I tracked the percentage on the deployment status board: 41%, 57%, 72%. My countermeasure synced to their clock cycles, heartbeat for heartbeat, pretending to be part of the system it was about to gut. 81%. Ash was grinning now, gesturing to a graph on a wall-mounted display. Maya leaned in, lips curling into the first sign of victory. I could almost hear her speech to the board, the one where she declared the new era, live. 85%. My finger hovered for half a breath. Then I tapped the key sequence only I knew. The phantom woke. In less than a second, their outbound data stream flipped on itself. Every packet destined for the masked domains became a corrupted checksum, salted with noise that mimicked authentic failures. The payloads they thought they were stealing transformed into mirrored databases, convincingly structured, but poisoned. Addresses leading nowhere. Financial records with digits scrambled beyond recovery. Internal maps folded back on themselves in impossible geometry. The more they pulled, the more the garbage multiplied, flooding their storage until even their indexing routines began to choke. On the war room feed, Ash froze mid-sentence. Their eyes darted to the side monitor, mouth tightening. Maya stepped forward, peering over a developer's shoulder. Her composure fractured in slow motion, the first sharp crease between her brows, the set of her jaw tightening as she realized the graphs were tilting the wrong way. She snatched a headset from the table, barked something I couldn't hear, then dropped it as a wall of error messages rolled across the main screen behind her. The consultants swarmed, fingers flying over keyboards, trying to trace the breach, but every path led to a legitimate process they themselves had initiated. They had no idea the enemy wasn't at the gate. It had been sitting in the keep, smiling, waiting for the drawbridge to lower. I watched her lips form the question I'd heard 100 times in rooms like this. "Who's inside?" I answered. Not with my voice, but with the only message I would send her. 4 words, no threats, no signature. I pushed it through a system log she'd have to open herself. "Your experience is outdated thinking." She read it. I saw the stillness take her over, the understanding sink past the panic. Her head lifted, eyes scanning the room like she could see through the walls. But she didn't look at the camera. She didn't have to. She knew. I shut down the feed and let the silence reclaim the room. Outside my network bubble, the cleanup had already begun. By noon, federal cyber task forces were swarming their office under the guise of routine compliance inspection. By mid-afternoon, Maya and her consultants were gone from every system they'd touched. Accounts disabled, domains seized, public contact information scrubbed. The official story in the news was bland. An internal security review. No threat to clients. All systems stable. The truth was folded into sealed reports that would never see daylight. I went to work on my own cleanup. Every trace of my involvement disappeared. Logs overwritten, keys shredded, access tunnels collapsed. The last backdoor I'd left in Stratagem's bones was erased with the same care I'd built it. When it was done, I sat back in the chair, watching the empty terminal, feeling the strange stillness that comes when the job is over and there's no one to tell you it mattered. The coffee was cold. I took one sip anyway, just to mark the moment, then carried the mug to the sink and left it there. The drives wound down, the hum fading until the only sound left was my own breathing. Tomorrow someone else will call me outdated. I'll smile again, nod again, and wait. Because I don't build systems for applause. I build them to survive.